My husband Austin abandoned me, and our newborn twins, because of his mother's demands, a wound that cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever known. I still remember that morning as clearly as if it were yesterday, when his family's mansion stood like a fortress of cold stone and manicured gardens, much like the icy words his mother would speak. As I later learned, Austin sat in their main living room that day, shrinking under his mother's authoritative voice that had controlled him his entire life. His mother's words were sharp as razors when she told him I wasn't good enough for him, that I never had been. She wielded her words like weapons, telling him I had no lineage, no family name, no position worthy of their dynasty. I know now that Austin loved me then, or perhaps still does, but his mother's shadow loomed larger than any love we shared. She controlled everything, the family fortune, the business, making it crystal clear that her legacy mattered more than her son's happiness. With delicate fingers tracing her fine china teacup, she told him it was all for his own good, that she was protecting their future. She warned him that staying with me would destroy everything they built, that I didn't belong in their world. I can picture Austin there, unable to meet his mother's gaze, each of her words crushing him further into submission. He was trapped between two worlds, the life we'd built together, with me as his wife who'd just given birth to his twins, and his world of wealth and power that he couldn't seem to escape. When he whispered, "This isn't fair," his mother merely raised an eyebrow, telling him fairness was a luxury he couldn't afford. She demanded he make a choice, her words falling like a judge's gavel on his shoulders. Standing by their grand window overlooking the garden, she declared I could never give him what he needed, never provide the future he deserved. She insisted that family was all that mattered, that everything else was temporary, including me. I learned later how Austin felt his throat tighten, struggling with the cruel decision before him. The happiness we'd found when we first met seemed like a distant dream at that point. I was different from the women Austin had met in his social circles, and he was captivated by my laughter and my view of the world. When our twins were born, Austin's life seemed perfect, or so he told me later. But that day, everything was about to crumble before our eyes. I remember how Austin slowly stood up in my apartment, his body heavy as if carrying a burden he didn't know how to let go. Before he left his mother's mansion that morning, she had delivered her final blow, telling him that money could buy many things, but not second chances. Those words had pierced his heart, and as he crossed the threshold of her home, they were forever etched in his memory. Hours later, Austin arrived at our modest apartment, where I lived with our newborn twins. It was far from the luxury he was accustomed to, but our home was filled with life and love. When he entered, the first sounds he heard were the soft cries of our twins and my voice trying to soothe them. I noticed his tired smile when he saw me. "Austin," I called out, holding one of our babies, my heart full of joy at his arrival. "We've been waiting for you," I said, still trusting him completely. I saw Austin swallow hard as he looked at me, exhausted but glowing, then his eyes fell to the tiny being in my arms. How could he even think of abandoning his own children, his own flesh and blood? I would later wonder. But his mother's words were hanging over him like a dark cloud, though I didn't know it then. While I was happily telling him about the twins' little adventures that day, he was hearing only the echo of his mother's authoritative voice telling him he had to make a choice. Every word I spoke, every smile I gave him seemed to make him shrink, as if he felt unworthy of being there. Finally, unable to bear it anymore, he interrupted my cheerful chatter. "Amanda, we need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with what I now know was guilt. I looked at him with slight worry in my eyes, still trusting, still completely unaware of what was coming. We sat together on the sofa, and I watched as Austin took a deep breath, his chest heaving with what would be the words that would change our lives forever. "I can't do this anymore," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "I just can't continue," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned in confusion, my heart beginning to race. "What are you saying? What can't you continue?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I watched as Austin clenched his fists, trying to control their shaking. Then he said the words that would shatter my world. He couldn't be with me anymore, that his mother had been right, that I didn't fit into his world, that we weren't meant to be. The silence that followed was deafening, like a physical presence in our small apartment. I stared at Austin in disbelief, my breathing becoming ragged as I desperately tried to hold back the tears that were already filling my eyes. "Your mother?" I repeated, my voice trembling with shock and hurt. "You're leaving me, because of her?" I managed to say, though the words felt like glass in my throat. Austin stood there in silence, and I could see in his eyes that he couldn't justify his actions, yet he didn't have the strength to defy his mother's will. All he could do was hang his head, stand up, and walk toward the door. "Sorry," he mumbled before walking out, not even looking back at me and our babies. The sound of the door closing echoed through our small apartment, but I barely heard it. The world around me had stopped the moment Austin's words left his lips, leaving me frozen in time with our twins. The tears I had been holding back now streamed down my face uncontrollably, soaking my blouse as I struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by one of the twins' soft cries, as if even my baby could sense the sorrow that filled the air. I held my baby closer to my chest, trying to find comfort in that tiny warmth against my heart. Taking deep breaths, I fought to keep myself together, knowing I couldn't completely break down in front of my children. They were depending on me, and I needed to be stronger than ever before. Minutes, or perhaps hours passed before I could finally stand up. My body felt weak, but I knew I couldn't afford to show any weakness. I had to move forward, one step at a time. Walking to the crib where my other baby was resting, I gently stroked that tiny head while thoughts flooded my mind. I remembered all the promises Austin had made to me, all those times he'd sworn we'd always be together, that we'd build a family. All of those promises had vanished like smoke in the wind. The first few weeks after Austin left were the most brutal I had ever faced in my life. The nights seemed endless, filled with the sounds of my babies crying mingled with my own tears, while the weight of loneliness slowly suffocated me. Each day was a battle with feeding the twins, changing diapers, and keeping up with housework, leaving me barely able to catch my breath. But deep inside me, a small but fierce flame began to burn. I knew I couldn't stay trapped in this pain forever, couldn't remain a victim of circumstances. I had 2 children depending on me, and life wasn't going to give me a break. I wasn't a woman who gave up easily, that wasn't in my nature. Though the void Austin left in my life was enormous, I began to understand that I needed to find a way to move forward, little by little. One morning, as I watched my sleeping twins, something shifted inside my heart. Looking at my tiny, innocent twins, I knew they deserved better, a future filled with opportunities. Though Austin had chosen a different path, I was determined not to let his absence dictate my children's destiny. With renewed determination, I set out to find work, though I knew it wouldn't be easy. The job market was particularly cruel to single mothers without experience, but I was ready to do whatever it took. My days were filled with sending resumes, attending interviews, and facing countless small rejections, but nothing could stop me. With each obstacle I overcame, I found myself growing stronger, though the nights were often filled with exhaustion and sorrow. One afternoon, after another disappointing interview, I found a small glimmer of hope in an unexpected place. I stepped into a local cafe to clear my mind, reflecting on how I'd always dreamed of having something to call my own. As I sipped my coffee, an idea began to take root in my mind. Starting my own business could not only provide income but give me a sense of purpose. Though I knew it wouldn't be easy and would require tremendous effort, I had already lost so much that I wasn't afraid to take risks anymore. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into planning, starting with what had always been my secret passion, creating customized children's clothing for online sale. I worked through the nights while my babies slept, designing, sourcing suppliers, and building my brand piece by piece. Day by day, the project took shape, and with each small step forward, I felt myself moving closer to something bigger than I'd imagined. The first few months were grueling, barely managing to balance childcare and work, often feeling as if I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders. But whenever I felt like giving up, I would look at my twins and remember why I was fighting so hard. They were my strength, my reason to keep moving forward. Slowly but surely, the sacrifices began to pay off. The online shop started gaining popularity, orders increased, and what had started as an impossible dream was becoming a tangible reality. I was no longer just a single mother, I was becoming a successful entrepreneur. I had taken the deepest pain of my life and transformed it into an opportunity to reinvent myself. As the business grew, so did my confidence. Each small success gave me more strength, and what once seemed insurmountable became distant memories. I was no longer the abandoned, broken woman, I had become a powerful mother who could face any challenge life threw at me. Austin's betrayal was no longer the center of my world, my children, my success, and my determination had changed me for the better. Though scars remained within me, each day became proof that I didn't need anyone else to find happiness. That morning, the air felt different, fresher somehow, as if I could sense deep within me that things were changing. The soft whisper of wind through my window kept me company as I sat at my computer in my small study. The twins were still asleep, and I had learned to savor these quiet moments in the house, these peaceful interludes in the whirlwind of daily life. The computer screen before me displayed increasing order numbers. Each order represented a satisfied customer, and every piece of clothing sold was proof that my efforts were bearing fruit. I had named my store, My Little Miracles, in honor of my twins, who had given me new reasons to move forward. The name couldn't have been more fitting, as through them, I discovered strength I never knew I possessed. The business started modestly, but word of mouth quickly brought mothers discovering my store with its unique clothes and customized designs. My Little Miracles gained popularity, with social media doing the rest. I started receiving messages from across the country, words of gratitude, praise, and even photos of smiling babies wearing my creations. Day by day, my dreams were becoming more real. Success didn't come without effort, the dawn after sleepless nights and anxiety-filled evenings wondering how to complete each order were part of the price. Sometimes when exhaustion wrapped around me, I remembered those first days after Austin left, when everything seemed impossible, and here I was now, moving forward and growing not just as an entrepreneur, but as a mother and as a woman. The doubts, anxieties, and fears that once paralyzed me no longer had a place in my life. With a deep sigh, I closed my eyes for a moment, enjoying the morning silence. I allowed myself to smile, not something that came easily these days, but today I felt I'd earned it. I had worked hard, fought through every adversity, and for the first time in a long while, I could taste success. My children were growing happy and healthy, and I had built something that not only secured their future but filled me with pride. Hours later, as the twins began to wake, their laughter and voices filled the house with joy, reminding me how fortunate I was. As I dressed them and prepared for our day out, I thought about how far we'd come. I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead anymore. I knew that whatever challenges I faced, I could meet them with the confidence of someone who had overcome the worst and emerged victorious. The afternoon came quickly, with an important appointment, an interview with a local magazine that had heard about my business. They were interested in my story, how a single mother had turned an idea into a thriving business. I felt nervous but excited, knowing this was not just a chance to tell my story, but an opportunity to inspire other women who felt trapped as I once did. I chose my outfit carefully. This interview wasn't just an interview, it was testimony to everything I had achieved. Looking in the mirror before leaving, I saw a different woman staring back at me. Gone was the anxious young woman who had cried over Austin's abandonment, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had rebuilt her life with determination. The interview was a success. The questions flowed naturally, and before I knew it, I found myself talking not just about the business, but about my personal journey. I didn't hide the difficult times or sugarcoat the pain of being abandoned, but I emphasized the importance of never giving up, of finding reasons to move forward even when everything seemed lost. The reporter caught me off guard with her final question. She asked if I would do anything differently if I could go back to when Austin left. I paused for a moment, considering my answer. Finally, with a gentle smile, I told her that no, I wouldn't change anything because everything that happened had led me to where I am. I explained that without experiencing that pain, I would never have discovered the woman I am today. Sometimes, I added, it's through losing something that we learn what matters most. Those words hung in the air like a powerful declaration of everything I had learned. After the interview, when the studio door closed behind me, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. I had spoken my truth, and that truth was powerful. The past, what Austin had done, the things that never came to be, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the present, and that present belonged to me and my children. When I got home, my twins ran to me with their contagious smiles, reminding me that life was beautiful despite everything. Each day brought new opportunities to grow, learn, and find happiness. Sitting on the living room floor, playing with my children, I couldn't contain my gratitude. Life had given me more than I could have imagined, in its own unique way. I knew now that I didn't need anyone else to complete my story. I was the author of my own destiny, and that destiny shone brighter than ever as I continued to face my fears and build my future. I could see how differently Austin's life had turned out. Since choosing to leave, his life had oscillated between luxury and emptiness. Surrounded by all the material things his mother had promised, he lacked what was most essential: meaning. His mansion, with its enormous windows and perfectly manicured gardens, felt strangely confining despite its open spaces and elegant decorations throughout. I learned later that Austin felt suffocated in that grand mansion of his. He would often walk those endless hallways, listening to nothing but the echo of his own footsteps, questioning if money and power were truly worth everything he had lost. During his sleepless nights, even his silk pillows and expensive sheets couldn't comfort him as his mind filled with images of me and the twins. He would lie awake wondering how we were doing, if our children had taken their first steps or spoken their first words. These questions tormented him, but he pushed them deep into his consciousness, afraid to face the truth because it meant acknowledging his mistakes. His mother constantly reminded him that he needed to focus on what she called important things. She would tell him he was born for greatness, that all their legacy would be his, but only if he maintained his focus. She insisted that I and the children had only been distractions. Every time she spoke, her words rang like a verdict in his ears. For years, she had been the strongest voice in his life, and though he had long accepted her control, he began to question whether everything he had done for her had truly led him somewhere worthwhile. As he watched the family business unfold, he couldn't help feeling that despite having everything, he had lost something far more valuable. One afternoon, while checking financial documents in his study, a restless feeling overcame him. Looking around at the walls covered in expensive art and exclusive designer furniture, everything gleamed perfectly, yet none of it fulfilled him. On impulse, he turned on the television, seeking distraction from his thoughts. What he saw made him catch his breath. It was me on the screen. I sat before the interviewer with a calm, confident smile, radiating a self-assurance I had never shown before. Photos of my designed children's clothing filled the screen alongside my brand name, My Little Miracles. Austin felt his world stop. His eyes couldn't leave my image on the screen. My voice was different than before, more grounded, as if the pain and sadness had become part of the past, replaced by unshakable strength. I spoke about my business, how I had started from nothing, alone with our children, fighting for each small success. But what disturbed him most wasn't the business part, it was seeing how happy I was with our children, proud of raising them without him. I told the interviewer that my children were my greatest motivation, that everything I did was for them, that they were my strength. Austin felt a sharp pain in his chest. The footage changed to show the twins playing in the park, laughing innocently. They looked so happy and full of life, but he couldn't bear to watch. The children he had abandoned no longer needed him, and I, the mother he had left behind, had succeeded without him. Regret hit him with overwhelming force. Seeing Austin's reaction to my smile on TV, to our children growing up without him, I could tell it was destroying him inside. I wondered if he finally realized how blind he had been, letting his mother dictate his life, throwing away everything that truly mattered. He started to look like a stranger in his own life, from what I could see. His mansion, business, money, all of it had lost its value compared to what he had lost. Though he turned off the TV violently, I knew my image and the twins would remain burned in his mind. His hands trembled as he breathed heavily, reality hitting him like a storm. He had abandoned his family for empty promises. Standing by his window, looking out at his meticulously maintained garden, he must have wondered what it was all for. What good was having everything if, at his core, he was completely alone? His friends, parties, and luxuries couldn't fill the void I'd left behind, and even his mother's approval, which he'd sought his whole life, couldn't give him the peace he needed. As time passed, I could see the weight of his mistakes becoming more unbearable for him. He dropped his head in his hands, muttering to himself that he had ruined everything. In that moment, he realized he needed to make things right, even if it was too late. As night fell heavily over the city, Austin found no comfort in his dimly lit room. The shadows stretched long across his walls, reflecting the emptiness eating away at him inside. Since seeing me on TV, a sense of torment had followed him constantly, the weight of his decision crushing any attempt to distract himself. The images of me and the children haunted him relentlessly. Our laughter, the pride in my voice as I talked about them, and the reality that I had accomplished everything without his help, it all haunted him. For weeks, he had tried to convince himself he'd made the right decision, that he'd done what his mother advised. But now, compared to what he'd left behind, everything seemed so distant and trivial. He sat in his living room surrounded by luxuries that no longer held any value, holding an untouched glass of wine. The reddish liquid reflected the soft lamplight but offered him no comfort. On the table before him sat a photograph of us from happier times, before everything fell apart. He looked younger then, with a carefree smile, and I was embracing him with a tenderness that now belonged to a distant past. His mind kept returning to the day he left us. He remembered the twins' cries, my tear-filled eyes, the desperation in my voice as I tried to make him stay. And yet he chose to run away, convinced that money and family legacy were more important than love. Now he understood just how wrong he had been. A deep sigh escaped his lips as despair suffocated him, waves of emotion hitting him with the force of an unstoppable tide. I could see the guilt consuming Austin as he stood there, the weight of losing his only chance at what truly mattered crushing him. He paced back and forth in his living room like a caged animal, driven by an uncontrollable urgency. I learned later that he had muttered to himself that he had to do something, his fists clenched in helplessness. The fear of facing me again, of confronting the consequences of his actions, overwhelmed him. He knew I probably wouldn't forgive him, that my life had become perfect without him. Yet he felt compelled to see me, if only to apologize, to let me know how deeply he regretted his actions. He couldn't live with the regret without at least trying to make things right. Without telling anyone, he grabbed his jacket and left the mansion. The crisp night air hit his face, clearing the lump in his throat slightly. The drive to my house felt like an endless journey for him. Each mile weighed heavily with doubt, yet simultaneously with determination. As city lights passed by, Austin finally faced the truth. He had abandoned his family for nothing, and the emptiness in his life couldn't be filled with promises of wealth or inheritance. When he arrived in my modest neighborhood, the contrast with his world was stark. The streets were simpler, the buildings humble, but they had a warmth his mansion lacked. He parked in front of my building but couldn't find the courage to step out of his car for several seconds. After everything he'd done, he wondered how he could face me. Finally taking a deep breath, he decided he couldn't keep running anymore. Each step toward my door echoed in his head like a hammer striking. At the entrance, his hand froze before the intercom. For a moment, he considered turning back without pressing it, but he couldn't run away anymore. With his heart pounding, he pressed the intercom. The sound echoed through the building, and those few seconds of waiting felt like an eternity to him. When I finally opened the door and stood before him, my hair was loose with strands falling across my face. But what shocked him most was the expression in my eyes. There was no anger, but also no trace of the love I had once shown him. Instead, what he saw completely disarmed him, my total indifference. When I opened the door, I called out Austin's name in a cold voice. I watched him swallow hard, searching for words. He started to speak, stumbling over my name, but his words caught in his throat. I stood there with my arms crossed, studying him in silence. Finally, I asked him what he was doing here, my tone deliberately distant. I could see the weight of regret deepen in his expression. He had come hoping to find some way of redemption, but looking at me, he realized it was too late. I was no longer the woman he had abandoned. I had changed, grown, and no longer needed him in my life. He finally managed to say, trying to keep his composure, that he had seen my interview. He added that he had seen the children, how happy they looked. I stared at him, my expression unchanged. Yes, was all I said at first. Then I told him we had found our own happiness. I added, my voice steady, that we hadn't needed him for that. The harshness of my words hit him like a slap, but he couldn't blame me. He knew he deserved it. After all, he hadn't just abandoned his family, he had forced us to find the strength to move forward without him. He mumbled, unable to meet my eyes, that he had made a mistake. That he shouldn't have left. I sighed, but kept any trace of sympathy from my eyes. Quietly, I told him I knew. But I reminded him that we couldn't turn back time. I pointed out that he had chosen his path, and we had been forced to move forward without him. He wasn't here to beg forgiveness or try to reclaim what we once had, he said, knowing it was impossible to go back. I could see his world crumbling around him. Though tears burned in his eyes, he fought to hold them back. He knew he could never reclaim what we once had. The night wrapped our neighborhood in heavy silence, broken only by Austin's halting words. I stood firm and unmoved before him, defined not by harshness but by the clarity in my eyes. There was no room left for anger or resentment anymore. My decision to move forward without Austin, made months ago, felt more certain than ever before. I watched him struggle to find the right words, but each time he opened his mouth, the weight of his mistakes seemed to crush him further. There was no escaping what he had done. I was no longer that fragile woman he had abandoned. Pain had changed me, not into a victim, but into someone stronger, more confident, and more complete. Austin's voice trembled as he spoke my name, forcing out an apology that seemed to crumble from his lips. He wanted me to know how sorry he was. I lowered my eyes for a moment, weighing his words carefully. After a long silence, I raised my gaze to meet his. My face showed no hatred, but no forgiveness either. I told him, with a calm that seemed to confuse him, that there was no need to apologize. I explained that the past wasn't important anymore, that what happened had happened. Neither of us could change it now. My words tore through him, but he couldn't argue. I was right, the past was far behind us, and any attempt to fix it would be futile. Still, Austin felt compelled to explain, if only to clear the conscience that had tormented him for months. With shame burning in his eyes, he confessed that he had acted out of fear. He told me his mother had convinced him that staying with us would ruin him. Yet he claimed he had never stopped thinking about me, about our children, about what we could have been. I let out a bitter laugh, his words holding no power over me anymore. With a touch of disbelief in my voice, I asked if he was just realizing this now. I questioned if he really thought coming here after everything I'd been through, saying it was a mistake, would change anything. I reminded him that he couldn't reclaim the lost time. I told him he couldn't change those nights I spent raising our twins in complete solitude while he enjoyed his luxurious life. I watched as Austin slowly nodded, accepting the harsh truths I threw at him. I watched as Austin's suppressed tears began to roll uncontrollably down his cheeks. In a whisper, he admitted that he understood, but still begged for one more chance. He pleaded to be part of our lives again, promising he could prove he had changed. My eyes softened, not from sympathy, but from a certainty that had been there from the start. I crossed my arms, trying to contain the mix of emotions stirring within me. I knew what Austin was asking was impossible. Even though a part of me might have wanted to give him a chance at redemption, I couldn't allow it. I told him, my voice firm but not cold, that there was no place for him in our lives anymore. I explained that I couldn't trust someone who had abandoned us when we needed him most. I assured him that our children were fine without him. They had learned to be happy without a father figure. I refused to put them in a position where they had to know a stranger who had chosen not to be part of their lives when he had the chance. I saw him catch his breath at the harsh reality of my words. Every second he had spent without us, every decision he had made choosing wealth over family, had led him to this moment of complete loss. His love for me and the children might still have been there, but it meant nothing now. I had rebuilt my life, and he was nothing more than a shadow of the past with no place in my world. He muttered in defeat, asking if there was nothing he could do. I shook my head gently. I explained that it wasn't about what he could or couldn't do, he had made his choice, and we had made ours. The cold night wind began to rise, and I watched him shiver. It wasn't just from the cold, but from the reality falling upon him like an irreversible verdict. He had come hoping to find something, a second chance, a glimmer of hope in the life he had thrown away. Instead, he found only closed doors and roads with no return. I added, more as a final goodbye than a genuine wish, that I hoped he would find what he was looking for. But I made it clear it wouldn't be with us. I watched as Austin absorbed the wave of pain, the deep ache in his chest, but he said nothing more. There were no words that could change what had already happened. I stepped back and slowly closed the door, leaving Austin alone in the darkness. Through the window, I watched him standing there before my closed door, and I could sense everything he once held dear vanishing before him. His mansion, inheritance, and his mother's empty promises, none of it meant anything anymore. Everything truly valuable in his life had slipped away, and he had no one to blame but himself. I saw how each step back to his car seemed heavier than the last. The street lights must have appeared blurred through his tears, and I knew my words were still echoing in his mind. He finally understood there was no going back, that he had lost everything. His loneliness seemed to settle deeper and darker than ever before. His drive back to the mansion must have felt endless. I imagined him driving almost unconsciously, unable to process what had just happened. The harsh reality of our conversation had overwhelmed him, the city lights blurring before his eyes. He had come hoping for a small opening, a chance for redemption, though that might have been naive. But I had been clear, there was no place for him in the life he had abandoned. When he reached his mansion, I could picture the iron gates opening slowly, their weight reflecting the emptiness inside him. That impressive building with its high ceilings and manicured gardens must have greeted him with its imposing presence, though everything it once symbolized for him had vanished. What was once a symbol of power and success now felt cold and empty to him. I could imagine him walking down those wide hallways, past walls decorated with now meaningless family portraits. His mother would be waiting in the main room, as always. She would be sitting on her leather sofa, wine glass in hand, observing with her usual air of superiority. Despite the late hour, she would be perfectly composed, as if her mere presence was enough to control any situation. When he entered, her eyes would fix on him, trying to read his thoughts. She asked him directly where he had been, more from curiosity than accusation. Austin didn't answer immediately. He dropped his keys on the table with a dry sound and sat before her, feeling a weariness that went beyond the physical. He stared at his mother, the woman who had been the pillar of his life, who had always controlled his destiny, wondering how everything had come to this. Finally, he told her in a voice full of resignation that he had been to see me. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she quickly resumed her usual demeanor. She asked him, taking a sip of wine, what he had hoped to achieve. She reminded him that I was no longer part of his life. She insisted that leaving me had been the right choice. I could imagine Austin staring at her, feeling waves of frustration building inside him. I later learned that Austin had always accepted his mother's words as absolute truth. But after confronting me that night, he finally realized how empty all those promises of success and power had been. He had sacrificed what mattered most under the manipulation of a woman who cared only about her legacy. He asked her bitterly if she thought she had been right. Standing in that opulent room, he demanded to know what he had gained, questioning the meaning of wealth in his complete solitude. The tension in the air was almost palpable as his question hung between them. His mother shifted uncomfortably, surprised by this sudden rebellion from her usually compliant son, but Austin wasn't finished. His voice was strong yet filled with pain as he told her he had lost me. He explained how he had lost his children, all to follow her wishes and preserve their family legacy. He asked what all of it had given him, an empty mansion and a thriving business with no one to share it with. His mother set her wine glass down with a sharp click, fixing him with an icy stare. She reminded him that he had everything anyone could want: power, wealth, and respect. She asked if he really doubted the decisions made for his future. Austin shook his head, his anger finally spilling over. He told her these had never been his decisions. They had always been hers. He explained how his entire life had been spent trying to meet her expectations, to avoid tarnishing their family name. Yet he had gained nothing, feeling more empty than ever. He realized he had nothing that truly mattered. This confrontation had evolved into something Austin never imagined possible. For years, he had never dared to question his mother or challenge her authority. But after losing me and our children, something had shifted inside him. He could no longer pretend that wealth brought satisfaction or that the family legacy was enough to fill the emptiness he felt. His mother, however, wouldn't yield. Her gaze hardened, showing no tolerance for her son's rebellion. She coldly stated that I had only been dragging him down. She told him not to deceive himself. She dismissed me as nothing but an obstacle. She referred to our children as burdens he didn't need. She insisted he had done what was best for himself and their family. I could imagine Austin feeling a lump in his throat, a mixture of frustration and sadness overwhelming him. I watched as Austin was momentarily speechless at his mother's coldness when speaking about her own grandchildren. It seemed as if she had never understood the meaning of family love, as if everything could be reduced to maintaining a perfect image. Austin, gritting his teeth and clenching his fists, reminded her that what she called burdens were his children. He pointed out that she had convinced him to abandon them. The silence that followed was deep and filled with pain. I could see in his face the realization that there was no going back. He had lived too long under his mother's shadow, and at the end of it all, he was left staring at the ruins of what his life could have been. He could no longer ignore the fact that by following her commands, he had lost what truly mattered. I watched as he slowly stood up and looked at his mother one last time. He told her, with determination in his voice, that he was going to leave all of this behind and find his own path. He admitted he didn't know how yet. But he was clear that he wouldn't continue living under these lies. His mother stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and contempt, but Austin had nothing more to say. He turned on his heel and left the room, walking away not just from the conversation, but from a life filled with others' expectations. As he passed through the mansion's doors, I learned later, he felt a mix of relief and fear. He knew facing what he had done wouldn't be easy, that the path to redemption would be long and lonely. But for the first time in years, he had made his own decision. It was a decision made for himself, not for his mother or the inheritance, but from a need to find something real. The cold dawn air hit his face as he stepped into the garden. He looked up at the star-filled sky and took a deep breath. The cost of inheritance had been high, but he was ready to pay whatever it took to rebuild his life. Even if it meant he would never be the same person again. The next morning, sunlight filtered through my curtains, filling my room with warm golden light. The twins played on the living room floor, their laughter filling the air, everything seeming to have found its natural rhythm. It was as if life had settled into a peace that had taken so much work to achieve. I watched them while sipping my coffee. This serenity hadn't always been present in our daily life, but now, after many battles, it had become our reality. Last night's encounter with Austin was still in my mind, not as a burden, but as confirmation that the past no longer controlled me. The woman who cried for him, spent sleepless nights wondering if she could move forward without his support, no longer existed. I had found my own path, proving I could not just survive but thrive. Sitting on my sofa, I watched my children grow, full of vitality and life. Every day, I taught them something new, and unknowingly, they taught me more about unconditional love. They were my motivation, my strength, the reason I had worked so hard. The business I had built, the success I had achieved, it was all for them. My little miracles wasn't just a trademark, it was a testament to the love that kept us moving forward. That morning, I had an important meeting. I had received an offer to expand the store to a new city. What had once seemed like a distant dream when I could barely handle online orders was now reality. My brand was established, and I found myself in a place I couldn't have imagined when I started this small business from my living room. I felt more ready than ever to take the next step. After finishing my coffee, I left the twins with the kind neighbor who had always supported me and headed to the meeting. Driving down streets I now knew like the back of my hand, my thoughts drifted back to Austin. I felt no bitterness toward him anymore. Time had healed me, and though I couldn't forget the hurt, it no longer ached like it used to. Our conversation the previous night had shown that he too had changed, finally facing the weight of his decisions. But unlike him, I had already chosen my path. And that path didn't include him. I knew I had come too far to turn back, and the life I had built, though not perfect, was mine. I hadn't needed anyone else to complete it. Arriving at the office for the meeting, I felt calm and confident. I knew I was ready for what was coming. As I discussed the future of the brand with investors, something dawned on me. I hadn't just built a successful business, I had created a fulfilling, satisfying life. I was a strong mother who had learned to value her independence, and every challenge I had faced had led me to this moment. The meeting ended with handshakes and satisfied smiles. My Little Miracles was ready to expand, and I was ready for everything that lay ahead. But more than the commercial success, what filled me with pride was knowing my children would grow up seeing me as their role model. They would grow up with an example of determination and courage. There would be no absent figure teaching empty lessons. They would be raised by someone who never gave up, who found a way to turn pain into growth. When I returned home, I was greeted by the sound of my twins' laughter floating through the door. As I entered, a smile spread across my face watching them run around the room with their endless energy. In that moment, I knew I had everything I needed. Nothing else was necessary. I had built a home filled with love, and that was all that truly mattered. Kneeling down, I embraced my children, their warmth filling the void I had once felt in my heart. I looked back on my past not with nostalgia, but with gratitude. The past had been my teacher, but the future was entirely mine to shape. As the afternoon faded and the golden light began to dim, I sat on the sofa watching my children play. My eyes shone with the confidence of someone who had found their place in the world. The pain of those first days, the lonely nights, and all the tears I'd shed had become nothing more than distant memories. They were merely shadows of a life I had overcome. The peace I felt wasn't temporary. I had worked for it, earned it, and when I looked at my children, I knew with certainty that the path ahead was bright, filled with opportunities and love. I have achieved everything I dreamed of, and the future is finally mine, ready to be embraced. That's my story of resilience and triumph over adversity. If you enjoyed this story of overcoming adversity, please subscribe to the channel so you can hear more heartwarming stories like this. Please like this video and share in the comments which parts touched you or moved you the most. I would love to hear your thoughts and continue sharing stories that inspire.